If we look back at the past 70 years, we know that the left has a strong presence on the court sometimes. So for us in the real world, it's difficult to figure out what to do with the Supreme Court. If there's no hope of a lefty court, then we should just weaken it. We should attack it. But if we can someday control the Supreme Court, then we want to leave the door open to strengthen it. So just as a thought experiment, think about how you would want the Supreme Court to function if you knew that socialists would never control it. Maybe you would want to abolish the power of judicial review, or maybe you'd want the Supreme Court to have jurisdiction over a really narrow range of cases. If we knew that we would always control it, then there's a whole range of tasks that we might delegate to them. Maybe it would still make sense for our lefty Congress to write tax policy and healthcare policy or something, but we might want the Supreme Court to step in and help with unpopular facets of the left agenda, since they're insulated from popular feelings. So these issues make it important to think about structure in a significant way. James Madison said, "If men were angels, no government would be necessary. If angels were to govern men, neither external nor internal controls on government would be necessary. In framing a government which is to be administered by men, over men, the great difficulty lies in this. You must first enable the government to control the governed, and in the next place oblige it to control itself." So if we really want to be thoughtful about court reform and the role of the judiciary, we have to think about all possible outcomes, where maybe it'll be like the early 70s and the Supreme Court will be the only foothold that the left has in national power. Or maybe it'll be like right now, where there are two milquetoast liberal branches of government, and then the judiciary is fully right-wing, fully reactionary. There's another quote that's kind of instructive on this point. "It is vain to say that enlightened statesmen will always be able to adjust these clashing interests and render them subservient to the public good. Enlightened statesmen will not always be at the helm." So we have to, at some level, consider the model of governance that we want, even if we're stuck with the Constitution that we currently have. The power of the Supreme Court has ebbed and flowed over the past 200 years. So if we are going to strive for another Warren Court, rather than just try to beat back the Supreme Court as much as possible, then we should think about what their role would be even in that better world. So imagine for a moment a Supreme Court that was very left-wing. What would conservatives say about it? They wouldn't just pick fights with the Supreme Court the way they pick fights with Bernie Sanders, where they say, Bernie Sanders wants to raise your taxes, I want to cut your taxes. They would make a different argument. They would say, not only do I disagree with this or that Supreme Court decision, but this decision shouldn't exist. This is improper. This is judicial activism. It's judges trying to encroach on my domain as a legislator. So there are these two separate and complicated dichotomies that get lost in these kind of dumb remarks about judicial activism. There's what is the proper role of judges? What is actually the job of a judge? And then what is beyond that realm of judging where they're sort of abusing their power? And then the other question is, what actually is law? Because a lot of legal questions are really similar to political questions. If you're trying to figure out whether gay marriage should be protected at the federal level, that seems like a political question. But when you're trying to determine whether the 14th Amendment abridges the power of states to criminalize gay marriage. It sounds different, even though the same outcome is ultimately at stake, whether you can get gay married in Mississippi. So the way that I've framed it here is that there are these three concentric circles of what is considered judging. In the middle, there's the things that judges must do. So I guess people wouldn't be happy if judges didn't do anything at all, if they were lazy, or if their opinions didn't help clarify the law. So I guess that's sort of the minimum. Even people who love judicial restraint want judges to be useful and to use their fancy degrees in developing the law and making the law clear. And then there are, you can see even on the judges must, that's kind of contentious. The judges could interpret laws in ways that we don't like. And then we might say that judges are allowed to further the cause of justice. Maybe they're allowed to temper political passions if the majority is infringing on the rights of members of minority groups. But then what are judges not allowed to do? They're not allowed to make the law. Well, in the task of clarifying and interpreting the law, they're gonna end up creating legally binding rules. And then similarly with law and politics, there's some things that are considered to be so important in the law that acts of a majority can't interfere with them. So Congress couldn't pass a law that says no newspapers are allowed anymore. Congress couldn't criminalize the press because not only does the text of the First Amendment forbid Congress from getting rid of the press, but also judges care about the First Amendment, and judges would believe that the First Amendment obliges them as judges to stop Congress from doing something like that. And then it gets fuzzier if you think about there are some things in the law that Congress is allowed to change. Legislators are called lawmakers. So even though law is the domain of judges and legislatures are the domain of politics, what they are doing in that chamber all day is making laws. So some features of the law are thought to be contingent based on election results. And then there are some things that would be laws that majorities aren't allowed to enact, sort of like with the newspaper example. You wouldn't be allowed to enact a ban on the press. This political cartoon illustrates that the only way to know which judge is a judicial activist is whichever one you disagree with. In the Senate confirmation hearings for Supreme Court justices, you'll always hear these people talk really thoughtlessly about how judges shouldn't be making the law. They're supposed to be an umpire just calling balls and strikes. Mark Tushnet, who's a legendary left-wing constitutional law professor, talked about the critique of rights in left-wing jurisprudence circles with reference to this tendency of rights law to narrow the domain of what can be debated in politics. So politics is the domain of pure will or preference, not subject to discussion and deliberation, except as each individual chooses to be influenced by others. Rights, or law, protect the domain in which political preferences are formed. And generally, once rights moves into some domain, it never comes out. Once the law has decided that an issue is at the discretion of lawyers and judges, it's really rare that that issue gets returned to the whims of electoral majorities, although what's happening right now with Roe v. Wade is a really notable counterexample.